Hello, everyone. I also, like my predecessors, would like to say thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference, and also to say that I am so deeply honored to be here at this panel with my friends and colleagues and two women who I deeply admire, Yasmin Barrios and Irma Alicia Velázquez. Just a quick note, my work on trials in Latin America began in Peru with the Fujimori trial in 2009 when he was convicted to 25 years for crimes against humanity. And I later, several years later, began working on a collaborative trial monitoring project for the Rios Montt genocide trial. Little did I imagine that I wouldn't say I abandoned Peru, but I've become deeply immersed in the Guatemala transitional justice experience. And so what I'm going to try to do here today is talk a little bit about the evolution of this process in the last several years. But I'm going to start with one case, one of the cases that I'm currently observing, and that's the Molina Tyson case. Emma Tyson Alvarez, who you see here to the far corner, she sits in a small, cramped courtroom, which you see right there. It's an early morning in March 2017, high up on the 14th floor of the main courthouse in downtown Guatemala City. She's waiting to hear the decision of the pretrial judge in the case she's brought against 5 senior military officials. Though retired, some of them are among the most powerful men in Guatemala. Behind her wire-rimmed glasses, Doña Emma's dark blue eyes reflect an ocean of sorrow. Sorry. I'm trying to get a lot in my 15, sorry. Her 14-year-old son, Marco Antonio Molina Tyson, was snatched from her arms in a horrifying revenge kidnapping carried out by the Guatemalan military after her daughter Emma, who you see here, a militant of the Guatemalan Workers' Party who'd been arrested a few weeks before, managed to escape military detention. And I'm told by those who know these things better than I that the Guatemalan military's motto was that the innocent pay for the crimes of the guilty. Doña Emma also possesses a fierce determination. She's spent 36 of her 81 years seeking justice for the violence visited upon her children by the Guatemalan military. As Doña Emma listens to Judge Victor Herrera Rios deliver his ruling, she holds the hands of her daughters, Ana Lucrecia and Maria Eugenia, her dedicated companion in this quest for justice. The judge speaks slowly and deliberately, carefully laying out his reasons for finding that there is, in fact, sufficient evidence to send each of the 5 defendants to trial. Among these defendants are senior military officers, long believed to be untouchable. Retired Army General and Army Chief of Staff, former Army Chief of Staff, Benedicto Lucas Garcia, who you see at the far end, who was Chief of Staff of the Army during the dictatorship of his brother Romeo Lucas Garcia from 1978 to 1982. He's viewed as one of the key architects of the Army's brutal counterinsurgency policy that, as we know, resulted in the death of 200,000 people and the destruction of more than 600 villages. And Manuel Callejas y Callejas, who is sitting in the middle, also a retired Army general, former chief of Army intelligence, also allegedly the founder of the powerful Cofradía, or Brotherhood, organized crime syndicate. After the hearing, Doña Emma tells me that she's satisfied with the judge's ruling. Not a day passes, she says, that we don't think about Marco Antonio. We no longer believe he'll be coming home, but we want to know what happened to him, and we want justice for those who did this to him and to Emma. Just 2 weeks ago, high-risk Court C, one of the sister courts that Yasmin Barrios sits on, which will hear this case, announced that the public and oral trial will commence March 1st, 2018. So about 2 years after the original arrests were made in the case and 36 years after the original crimes. The Molina Tyson case is one of a number of emblematic cases of wartime human rights violations that are making their way through the Guatemalan legal system. We've heard here already about several cases that have come to fruition that have resulted many in convictions. I'll talk a little bit about this, but I want to talk about these ongoing cases. Another critical, oh sorry, I missed that slide. Another critical case is the Creon Paz case. 14 senior military officials were arrested in January 2016 in this case, which Attorney General Thelma Aldana has described as the largest case of enforced disappearance in Latin America. Acting on a tip that victims of the armed conflict were buried at the site of a former military base in Coban, Alta Paz, the Attorney General's office obtained a judicial order in 2012 to conduct exhumations that is now at the site that is now the site of a UN peacekeeping training center, Creon Paz. Exhumations were conducted by the FAFG, and Freddie Picciarelli will speak with us later. To date, the FAFG has uncovered 565 human remains at this military base, this former military base. 94 of these are children. 145 of these individuals have been identified using DNA testing. Of the original 14 men arrested, 8 have been found eligible, not eligible, that's the wrong word, ready to go to trial. But the case has been tied up in a series of appeals. So for now, we don't have a trial date. In addition to these cases, as we heard, I think, yesterday, the genocide trial against Rios Montt and Rodriguez Sanchez has recommenced for the 4th time. I was in the courtroom on October 13th when, well, I wasn't in the courtroom in the morning because that's closed to the public, but I was in the courtroom in the afternoon in the Rodriguez Sanchez case. There is another trial pending against Rios Montt for genocide and crimes against humanity in the Dos R's massacre case. And there's a trial pending against former Caibi Lopez Santos, also in the Dos R's massacre case. And there are other cases under investigation in the Attorney General's office that may move forward as these cases have. I'm not going to go into detail about the background of the conflict. We have heard about that, the foundings of the Truth Commission and so forth. What I want to talk about is the fact that for decades, as we know, those responsible for these crimes eluded criminal responsibility. Aside from a few high-profile cases, as discussed yesterday by Helen Mack, the cases of the murders of anthropologist Myrna Mack, Monsignor Gerardi, there were no criminal investigations really until 2008. And that's when we began to see a sea change in Guatemala. It's maybe a small sea change, but it's become, I think, quite significant. And you can see here a list of all the cases that I've been able to find that between 2008 and present have resulted in a conviction. We know that the genocide case, the conviction was partially the proceedings were partially suspended, thereby vacating the verdict, a decision that I believe and others believe was illegal, which I can talk about later. But what we can see by this, well, I guess you can't see it by this, but the fact is most of those prosecuted until the genocide case were foot soldiers, members of civil defense patrols, military commissioners, soldiers, and occasional low-level official. Not until the genocide case was a senior ranking official prosecuted for these crimes. What has made these prosecutions possible? I think the most important thing, without a doubt, is the determination of the survivors and the families of the victims. People like Doña Emma, who've persisted in their search for truth and justice despite the odds and the time past. Also important is the emergence of a new generation of prosecutors who began to take seriously the crimes of the past. The international role has been important. I won't get into any detail, but the inter-American system has played a critical role. The international cases, the cases in the United States in which people have been extradited or deported back to Guatemala, The case in Spain that Molina mentioned this morning have also generated pressure on Guatemala to prosecute cases domestically. The role of the CICIG, which was touched on a little bit yesterday, has also been important, not because CICIG addresses these cases, because it can't by its mandate, but the CICIG has helped strengthen the power of the prosecutor's office. It's also helped strengthen judicial independence. In large part, the creation of the high-risk court was very much a result of the presence of CICIG. Again, though, the senior military officers until 2013 were not included in these trials. And I'm not going to, I had a whole thing about the Rios Montt trial that I don't really have time to talk about, but there's some great pictures. So I'll just kind of slide through them very quickly. There's Jasmine reading the verdict. This is the moment when he realizes he's being convicted. And he's just realized he was acquitted. Rodriguez Sanchez. This is the room erupting. This is after. There was tremendous backlash, both during the genocide trial and after. Orchestrated by retired military officers, business elites, conservative politicians who thought they could make the trial go away with a combination of old-fashioned terror campaigns and by trying to bury the proceedings in a series of appeals, recusals, and other legal motions. The Foundation Against Terrorism, led by Ricardo Mendez-Ruiz, has been critical in this process. During the trial, he published, and another anonymous circulars were published in the Guatemalan media, directly attacking many of the individuals, if not all of the individuals, who had a role in the genocide trial. And here you can see one of the anonymous circulars. And you can see the three judges of the tribunal. You can see Claudia Paz y Paz. You can see Orlando Lopez, the prosecutor in the case, the pretrial judge, Miguel Ángel Galvez. And these after the trial, the intimidation campaigns, the backlash continued. Claudia Paz y Paz was removed from office 6 months early. There was a sanction imposed against Judge Barrios, and then a series of, Mendez-Ruiz primarily, but others as well, began filing a series of what I think are spurious charges against diverse participants in the legal process, including against witnesses, against prosecutors, and other judicial operators. I won't talk about this, but that's a whole other story. Honestly, my view at that time, 2014, as all this backlash was underway, Claudia was removed from office. I and others, I think, were very concerned that this may, in fact, be the end of Guatemala's transitional justice process. But, you know, what I've come to learn, years of studying and observing and writing about these trials, is that once started, these proceedings, or these processes rather, have a way of pushing forward even against the greatest of obstacles. And after those massive 2015 anti-corruption protests that brought down former President Pérez Molina, himself accused of involvement in the genocide, but not yet on trial as such, there was a new impetus for these cases. January 2016 was the key moment. The Attorney General's office arrested those 18 senior military officials in the Creon Paz and Molina Tyson cases that I mentioned a moment ago. And then in February 26th, the Asarco Trial took place. And I won't spend too much time on that because Irma Alicia spoke about it a little bit. But the two military officers were found guilty and sentenced to 140 and 240 years by the court, which was led by Judge Barrios. And I think this reinvigorated the conversation in Guatemala about the significance of these trials. And I think has been important in allowing these other cases to continue moving forward. Those are the victims that at the moment the verdict had been read aloud. So while Rios Montt's verdict was vacated, and he's now under house arrest, doesn't have to go to the trial that has been reinitiated against him, won't face any sentence, any punishment if he's found again guilty. The other senior military officers who were, like Rios Montt, architects of Guatemala's brutal counterinsurgency are now behind bars. That is hugely significant. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, several of those facing trial played a key role in the rise of clandestine parallel powers that operate as organized crime syndicates and are responsible for the massive corruption schemes that are now being investigated, and some of those responsible are being put on trial. Just, I think it was last week, Judge Galvez determined that there was sufficient evidence to move to trial in the case against former Vice President Roxana Baldetti and former President Otto Pérez Molina. And some of these individuals are very close to the sitting president, Jimmy Morales, who was elected in 2015 following these anti-corruption protests that led to Pérez Molina's removal. Okay, I'm being told that I have to stop, so I can't talk about these 5 individuals that I'd like to talk about, because I think what's interesting about them is their profound connection with crimes of the past, but also crimes of the present and structures that are meant to maintain the institutionalized impunity that has kept Guatemala in a situation of violence, poverty, and corruption for so many years. I would just like to end by saying, 3 decades after the worst atrocities occurred in Guatemala, some of the most senior military leaders of what could fairly be described as the deep state are finally jailed and facing prosecution. Are those lights telling me I need to stop? Is that what that is? Or is it like disco time? Oh, I can do that. Now I've completely lost my train of thought. But I'll leave it there. And I do have some lessons learned from the Guatemala case that I could talk about either in the Q&A or if any of those of you here are interested in the aftermath. Thank you very much.